So the crux of the book really talks about drugs in relationship to love. It's no surprise the book is
Yeah.
called Love Drugs, which I think is a great name. It talks about how drugs are currently affecting relationships, how they could affect relationships in the future, how they could help you with a breakup, for example, how they could help you maintain your relationship. It goes into a lot about that. But in order to have that discussion, I think it's important to define, or how do you define love? Because we're talking about, it talks about, the book talks about love in a very chemical way, which I like. I find it refreshing, but it's not a romantic view of love. It breaks it down as a bunch of, I don't want to say random, but a bunch of chemical processes that are occurring in our bodies. People like to think of love in a much more Cinderella type story way, but that's not the definition of love in the
Well,
book.
there's a couple of ways of defining love. One is what we refer to as a normative definition of love. And this is where sometimes philosophers will put certain necessary and sufficient conditions for what they think makes something count as love or what they think should count as love. So they'll say something like, in order for it to count as love, it has to be purely unselfishly motivated, where you take the other person's well being as an end in itself and try to promote that in certain ways. They might say that love is incompatible with any kind of abusive behavior. So if that exists in a relationship, whatever the people are feeling, just by definition, can't be love on this kind of a view. And we're fine with those kinds of debates and how people want to carve out a definition of love that's this more prescriptive kind of definition. But for our purposes, we wanted to take a more descriptive route that was pretty open ended, basically, so that when we're describing cases in the book of people who claim to be in love, we don't have to always link it back up to some philosophical account. We can just say people experience love in different ways, they conceive of love in different ways. There might well be disagreements about whether a particular feeling that someone has, quote unquote, should count as an instance of love. But we don't think that those debates are particularly relevant to our question, which is just, are there circumstances in which it's all things considered permissible or a good idea to introduce a drug into a relationship, whether or not you think it affects a certain conception of love? But I'll expand on our descriptive account just to give you a better sense of how we do think of love in the book. You talked about the Cinderella version of love, which positions it as something like a feeling that we have in our disembodied soul, and we tend not to think of it as related to the body. And we don't actually discount the cultural and historical and literary approaches to thinking about love. We suggest that those exist in one of the dimensions of love, which we call the psychosocial or historical dimension of love. And then we just express that the biological dimension of love is another dimension of the phenomenon that has been neglected throughout much of history because we just didn't have a very good understanding of the biological dimensions of love. But the more that we understand that aspect, that dimension of our subjective states that are experienced within a certain socio-historical context, the more we should decide whether we want to just remain in the dark about that biology, in which case we might be taking drugs for other purposes and inadvertently affecting the love that we have with those that we care about, or whether we want to try to understand those processes better. And just as we try to think about making sense of love through art and through poetry and through pop culture and conversations and songs and so forth, so too may we want to make sense of the biological dimensions of love through science. It's not either or. Both of these ways of thinking about love are valid and important, and love just is a multidimensional phenomenon that has both a subjective experiential aspect, that has a social and conceptual aspect whereby different societies will decide what counts as love in a given context. And all of these things are underwritten to some extent by biological processes, which are increasingly being better understood by scientists.
That's not a sexy way of looking at love. Like I said, I like it. I think it's helpful to look at it in that framework because it can help you understand
Well,
your
it depends on
feelings
what you think
better.
is sexy. I think that there is sometimes people think that something being mysterious or beyond our ability to make sense of it is the very thing that makes love valuable. And I'm not so sure that's true. We give this example of later in the book. It's an analogy where we say, imagine that you spent all day in the kitchen making your favorite chocolate cake. And you know all the different ingredients that go into it, and you tend to them with care, and you put it in the oven at exactly the right time, and you take it out, and then later, when you eat the cake, it's delicious. It still has the value of the experience of eating the chocolate cake, notwithstanding the fact that you know quite a lot about how those properties came to be in that particular way. So it's not conceptually a necessity that knowing something or another about how love works in our brains as well as in our minds and in society will rob it of its value. Being in love still feels a certain way, and it feels a way that's very valuable. And even if you recognize that part of the reason why it feels that way has to do with, certain neurochemicals doing whatever they're doing in your brain, it's not clear that that negates the experience. The experience is still going to be powerful. And in this way, you might be able to exercise some agency over your relationship so that instead of just magically falling into love and then magically falling out of love and saying, well, I guess I better just leave my relationship, maybe you can take some steps to try to foster love or facilitate love or enhance the quality of love between you and your partner. And those things require understanding at least a little bit about how love works.